Hello, class. Today we're going to go over the classical and medieval West. It's a big time period, but we're going to go over it in one lecture. So to start, we have, of course, the influence of Greece, as you might have seen in that documentary you watched, with the concept of beauty, right? That it is possible to have an ideal, have a perfect scenario for a human. Classical Greek and Roman cultures dominated Western civilization, as you know, from the 5th century until the decline of Rome. The 5th century BCE, before current era. Greek culture in particular regarded humankind as the closest thing to perfection in physical form. So this idea of the power of reason and justice and philosophy and math and art, all these sort of endeavors that humans go after. They believed that gods had human weaknesses. Zeus came down and was attracted to certain women, etc. That mortals had godlike strengths. They could try to become like godlike. And again, the importance of the individual, which of course, as you can imagine, relates to their development of democracy. Here's just a quick map. Of course, we were talking about Greece, so these city-states and some islands over here, and then we'll get into Rome in a second. So we're talking about classical art mainly, but of course it doesn't just appear overnight, right? It slowly grows and develops throughout the time periods. The period before classical, or right before the classical period in Greece, is called the Archaic period. That's between 800 and 480 BCE. The best known thing from that era are painters and vases, essentially. So if you've seen vases, however you want to pronounce it, like this, that's typically from the Archaic period, right? And they're beautifully painted, really well done paintings. This is some of the sculpture from that period, the Archaic period. You can tell that it's very rigid, right? And that's because it's influenced by the Egyptians. The style is very Egyptian, very rigid, very formal. However, unlike the Egyptian style, it actually honors individual achievements. So it's not just rulers and gods that get to have their own sculpture. And so this is just a standing youth, right? And there was a female version also. Right after the Archaic, of course, we jump to the Classical period, so 480 to 323 BCE. Art that emphasizes rational simplicity, order, and restrained emotion is kind of the hallmarks that you can think of. And we get increasingly naturalistic sculpture. Here we have an example of the spear bearer. So this blemish-free, they could polish the marble, this blemish-free human body, prime of life athlete. This term of using the bending of the hips and then that sort of counterbalance with the shoulders is called contrapposto. You might have heard that. And that's the ability to show something at rest and also in motion. These sculptures here, they use the idea of the perfect mathematical sort of ratio proportion of a human body, and it's still used today. And in terms of the height, it's like the height from the top of the head to where the hips end is usually the same height from here to the bottom of the feet. And no real human has that proportion. Supermodels come close, and so that idea of beauty sticks around. And if you ever wondered, why Greek sculpture might have small, penises, is because, they didn't consider that an ideal for a man. It was never a badge of virility or manliness in ancient Greece to have, that large penis. So the potency came from the intellect and needed to run your family, to sustain the society, etc. So that is why that's that. I'm not going to actually have this on the quiz. This might be like a normal quiz question. What are these orders? But if you ever wondered, here they are. We have this one started first, right? Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian got much more elaborate. The Parthenon, and this has a careful ratio of 4 to 9 proportions throughout. None of the lines in the columns, the actual lines of the building, are straight. They look straight, just like how we talked about proportion and scale, how circles next to smaller circles maybe don't look the same size. They were smart enough to know that, yeah, a straight line won't actually look straight when you look at it. So what they did is they actually created it like this. So these columns have a slight bulge near the center, and then also the bottom floor, the frieze, all this has a slight bulge that when you look at it, it looks straight. Because you're down here looking up at it, or from far away. Gives the impression that it's straight line. Really cool stuff. Here's the golden ratio, which is a law of proportions. A lot of things that we still have today are in this proportionality, and this is just a famous example of that, using that proportions. We go on to the later classical period. This is a Roman copy, which most of the things we're looking at in terms of sculpture are actually Roman copies. Before this, nude goddess sculptures were not commonly known. And again, this idea of the feminine ideal, like the masculine ideal that we saw earlier, sticks around for a long time. This later period led away from noble and serious and started favoring the sensual ideas. And just to point out that these things were painted. They look very like austere and like old, right? Because they're white and they give this feeling, but they were, of course, at that time painted in really bright colors. In some ways, they might look kind of absurd if we were to consider them that way now. After the classical period, we move on to the Hellenistic period, which most historians date from 323 BCE to 30 BCE. This sees the decline of Athens as a city-state. Art that's made from Greece is actually made for others outside of Greece. So Macedonia, etc., the areas that have beaten Greece at war are in power, but Greeks are still making art. This Hellenistic period is defined by much more dynamic, expressive, and exaggerated sculptures, as you can see here, but also everyday things, portraitures of people, historical, mythical events, etc. This group here, too, you can see it's very theatrical. Again, this is a Roman copy of the Greek original, and we have, total and utter agony. We also see a return to hierarchical proportion, where this guy, as the father, is more important than the sons for story purposes, and then therefore is much larger, like he would be a giant even amongst his sons there. And you can see the face, the agony in the face. We're going to switch to Rome. So, of course, Rome grew in power during the Hellenistic era, much like Macedonia did. It's a major power in the Western world, if you didn't know that. Its empire includes Western Europe, North Africa, the Near East, shores of the Mediterranean. And Rome is identified, Roman art is especially emphasizing public use. That reflects the need to administer a huge empire. And being a Roman citizen was a big deal. Roman art can be seen as more practical, less idealistic than the Greeks, because they were focused on running an actual empire. Here's a bust of an emperor, and their portraiture sculpture has a high degree of individuality, and the imperfections are recorded to give character. They don't make this person look better than they actually are. They try to, in some ways, they do that, but they do show, more individuality, more imperfections. Rome, of course, also develops the rounded arch, is an important thing to know. Before this, there's the post and lintel sort of construction, where you just, like Stonehenge, put this on top of two uprights, and it doesn't work well. Like it's weighty, it falls down, it's not strong, it's actually hard to construct. So they developed the rounded arch, and if you've ever been to Rome or any parts of Italy, you will see them all over the place. And what that does is, of course, it allows weight to distribute down and then out. So big deal, right? They perfected the rounded arch, they developed concrete, they made huge public works projects. As you see here, the Colosseum, Colosso, we can see the rounded arch throughout. What's interesting here, too, is they have shown the architectural orders of the columns throughout. So we start with the Doric, Ionic, and then Corinthian at the top. Little art history lesson within that building. the Pantheon in Rome. It's amazing to walk around Rome and just kind of stumble upon these things like the Pantheon. At night especially, the views are amazing. Here's an inside painting of it from 1734. We're using a painting because it's actually really hard to photograph and make it look as interesting as this painting. I would recommend trying to see if you can find a photo that does justice that what this painting already does. We have a coffered dome, a coffered dome, which is these squares that kind of sit into it. This is poured concrete, and it gets thinner as it gets to the top. At the top, we have the oculus, which allows the light to come in. And one could imagine that this is meant to be the sun, right? And then this dome is heaven, right? The surrounding sky around Earth. Romans also, of course, made paintings. They were painted inside of homes. They show this love of luxury. This one in particular survived from Pompeii, and it's from a villa near Naples. We have a very complex urban scene, and you can see that there's this somewhat of a little bit of understanding of perspective. So perspective meaning that this line goes back into a point, as does this line. There are quite a few mistakes. You'll see this one going up, right? And maybe it doesn't feel entirely accurate here, but there is a beginning of understanding of perspective, which of course completely collapses after the Roman Empire, as we'll soon see. While Rome is kicking, right, we have this development of early Christian faith and early Christian art. Followers of Christianity were, of course, initially forced to hide their practice. They would practice and have their art inside of private homes and in underground burial chambers called catacombs. Here's an example of a fresco in a catacomb, Christ and the Apostles. Remember what a fresco is, right? It's plaster wet plaster that's been painted while wet. And we have a little bit of a hierarchical scale here where Jesus, as you maybe don't recall seeing him, like it's not your typical looking Jesus. Looks like a Roman senator rather than our prototypical idea of what Jesus looks like, sitting at the center. And so these are, of course, were used as sort of storytelling devices. Visual aids have been important forever in humans' desire to tell stories and to practice their faith. And again, in catacombs that are hidden, and they can work. So Christianity, of course, slowly becomes acceptable in Rome, and then Constantine eventually becomes Christian, and makes it an official religion. The whole idea of Christian art is that the spiritual values are stronger than the failing stability of material world. So your material self is not as important as your spiritual self. And you can see that in the art. And that's the reason. It's not because the artists were crappier. It's because that's the culture, right? That's what's important. Here's the head of Constantine, which was once part of an immense figure. The look is totally different. It's a strange head. It's not realistic. It's not naturalistic. It's not classical, right? These large eyes, stiff features. And this is, again, to point out this idea of the spiritual self. Here's a estimation of what it used to look like, and the comparison size. So this is about human height, this foot, and then this colossus of Constantine. Yeah, very, right? Thick, if nothing else, and strange sort of heads, and that's because that's what mattered. Here's a map to just refresh you. So we were in Rome, and Constantine decides to do what? Go build a new city over here, Constantinople, the new head of the Roman Empire. And they do that, of course, because of it's a good location, right? For trade, for strategy. Like you have these people coming from the north to attack these areas. This gives you some waterways and can only be attacked from here as long as you support this area over here. And of course, you can trade a lot too. So they moved the capital there, and it stood until 1453, until it fell to the Ottoman Turks. The Roman Empire was divided. The western half collapsed in 476. Of course, it was recreated in many ways, Holy Roman Empire, but we'll get to that in the next lecture. The survival of the Byzantine Empire allowed for a lot of extensive building programs, and used I'll just show it, basilica. So the basilica was, in ancient Roman times, made for where the courts were. And so Byzantine architects converted it into making it for public worship. And I assume because it made sense for that. Like that sort of setup made a lot of sense for having people come in and worship together at the same time. It's a layout of a map of a basilica and what they would look like in imagination. Lots of color, right? So these things that you see that look all white and feel old and austere were not that way. They were packed with color, much like your color television. This is Empress Theodora. Famous Byzantine art uses, there's a lot of mosaics, and these mosaics use what's called tessera. Tessera is colored glass and marble. This style direction, again, is because that's what that culture wanted. In particular, this was influenced by a controversy over the biblical prohibition against worshiping graven images, right? And those who wanted pictures to tell sacred stories. There was this kind of battle. The argument that the people that wanted to depict the images would say was that this highly stylized imagery could not be confused with a real person, so there should be no problem. Byzantine art is also, it's very flat but decorative. Again, the importance of spirit, the unimportance of the physical body. Here's a mosaic that happens inside of an apse, so that's the rounded central location of the basilica. This stuff, the way that it's made, because it's glass, marble, it really shines, it glows, and not realistic in terms of how they're sitting. Very stylized. And that's all on purpose. So we have this idea about iconoclastic controversy. So these are iconoclasts. They want to destroy images that they believe break the commandment to not worship. An argument that someone could make, people in the past made, iconophiles, would be that Christ was both divine and human, so it's actually okay. And the East and West, of course, split because of this. The Western continues the Roman tradition of showing images. The Eastern is more closely supervised to not. This is an icon painting by Andrei Rublev, a famous Russian artist. It's a great example of Byzantine art. He's Russian, it's Orthodox, it's the mystical over the physical. There is this, his sort of paintings are fantastic. They're really tender with expression. You'll notice he totally elongates the bodies. And these bright colors still exist today. They still last today. So who knows? These would be extremely bright and colorful back in the day. We'll talk about it in another chapter, but there's a lot of similarities between Eastern Byzantine art and Islamic art. It's very decorative. It tries to avoid depicting God and Jesus, very flat. And then many of these are destroyed because of the iconoclast, right? So who knows how many even were there back then. We have no idea how many still exist. So from there we move on to the Middle Ages, which is a Western idea, right? It comes between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rebirth or renaissance of Greek and Roman ideas in the 15th century, so the Middle Ages. This in some way demeans it. Of course, a lot of things are happening. A lot of artists are making great work, but it's still a term we use. The time we have is like 300 current era to 1400 current era. And we'll start with early medieval art, which absorbs the influence of the nomadic invaders from the north. It's based on horse culture with no written language, and it's typically shown with like really well done small metalwork with these interlocking designs and gold and what's called enamel that would be fired up and hardened inside these lines. You can see why this would be of nomadic use and value, right? It's small, it's beautiful, jeweled, etc. And these styles, even after the kind of nomadic times stopped and towns developed with churches, translated. So this gold, these interwoven patterns came into things like the Book of Kells here, which is a illuminated manuscript, a book made for nuns to read. From there we go on to Romanesque, 1000 current era, which of course means Roman-like. There's stone basilicas and carvings, rounded arches everywhere. Essentially, if you see a church that has rounded arches, it's going to be Romanesque. There's a lot of Byzantine influence because these two empires are still, they're still talking, they're arguing, they're fighting, they're getting together in various ways. So a lot of decoration, flatness shows up. This here is what's called a reliquary, which are a huge thing at this time. They're used to hold sacred objects, and pilgrims come to visit. Pilgrimage is, of course, very important in this era. It's like how your church, your city, gets money from tourist dollars. This is Saint Foy. She was a young Christian girl who refused to recant her faith during Roman times, and for that she was tortured and burned in an oven, which these horrible things befall all these saints, and they have these sort of amazing images that you may have seen, like Saint Sebastian being shot with arrows. They usually show how they died in some way, some form. This is a reliquary, so it has to hold something actual inside it, and this one supposedly holds her remains inside the reliquary itself. I showed the basilica down here again to show you this was the design, and this helped with the pilgrimage, so that, let's say the reliquary is here or downstairs, the pilgrims could come in, walk down the aisle, and see the reliquary or whatever they had here without disrupting the actual service. So that function works well. There's a lot of awe and fear-inspiring stone carvings. The need for larger churches, right, to hold more people. These monumental, impressive sculptures. Of course, architecture in particular has this feel of solid stability and power. You can build a large structure. And these projects took a long time, almost always to be completed after the death of the person who either commissioned it, started to build it, stone carvers, etc. These were big projects for certain areas. In this case, you can see Jesus, you don't need to be told, of course, he's the most important, therefore he's the largest image, largest person. And then these other ones are stories throughout the zodiac, stories of the Bible. So they are meant to tell a story, to invoke awe, and to invoke fear too. There's a bunch of ones with demons that are great. This is a 20th century copy of a nun who had visions and was allowed to go through Germany and start a lot of different, nunnery, monasteries. And so I just like this one because it shows her having that vision, right? And then this beautiful, abstract, surrealist image that this nun had visions of. Really intriguing stuff. We move on to Gothic art, which started about 1145. It started in northern France and spread. It lasted longer in areas like Germany and much shorter in areas like Italy. The round arch is superseded by the pointed arch. So if you see a pointed arch, you know it's Gothic. If you see a rounded arch, you know it's Romanesque. So what pointed arch allows you to do is you don't need as much material to buttress. So here's showing you kind of how the forces work. You need these really thick walls of the Pantheon to hold the arch. With a pointed arch, you don't. You can have these gaps, and then these walls don't have to be nearly as thick and can have a lot of open space. And these are called flying buttresses. So what can you do when you have, you can go taller and you have open space? You can, of course, fill those with stained glass windows that give this amazing experience of letting the light in, changing the color, and telling the story of your religion. This is Saint Chapelle in Paris. Beautiful. Highly recommend going if you ever get the chance. Really fantastic stuff. So this allows them to put in a lot of stained glass windows. And then finally we have the Chartres Cathedral. So it is a Notre Dame, but it's not the Notre Dame you're probably familiar with. This is a church that changes a lot from 1145 to 1513 because of fires, because of directions, because of people in power deciding X, Y, and Z, things collapsing. It changes quite a bit. Here we have what's called a rose window, which you'll see here. Beautiful example of what's called a rose window. and the front, which is well known because of its two different towers. And that's because this one was made in 1160, which is in that type of Gothic art. And then this is made in the 1500s, which is much more flamboyant. It's got all these little parts and little sculptures, completely different than this one. And yeah, it's got all these great sculptures throughout. When you walk in, around the sides, like these little demons sort of trying to influence humans in a negative way. So not only was it, awe-inspiring or fear-inspiring, it's also kind of funny. And then these elongated, super elongated figures that are part of the column, that are holding up part of the church. And that's it. Thank you.